This is the story of how Francis Scott Key killed Dr. Reuben Crandall, an abolitionist. Francis Scott Key is a slave owner. Dr. Reuben Crandall was an abolitionist. Okay, so let's start from the very beginning. The year was 1835, and Washington, D.C. in the 1830s was growing fast. It used to be just a dirt road with a few houses, but in 1835, Washington, D.C. had a population of 20,000 people. The majority of black folks living in Washington, D.C. were free blacks. 25 years before South Carolina would fire the first shots of the Civil War at Fort Sumter. So the majority of the black folks living in Washington, D.C. in 1835 were free. The location of where Washington, D.C. itself would be located was a political decision. It had been speculated that the federal capital should be on the Susquehanna River, in between Pennsylvania and Maryland. But the slave owners and their politicians didn't like that because Pennsylvania had almost abolished slavery for everybody by 1800. And the slave owners and their politicians in Congress did not want to have the capital of the United States on free territory. Symbolically, this suggested that there was something wrong with the institution of slavery. So the slave owners and their politicians pushed Alexander Hamilton to move the capital site further south, cutting a federal district out of Maryland and Virginia where slavery was legal. For the time being, slave owners were happy with this arrangement since this preserved the legitimacy of slavery. So I'm going to say it again. During the 1830s, free blacks would outnumber slaves in Washington for the first time. And it's important with the location of Washington, D.C. symbolically when it came to slavery, just like the legalization of marijuana. In Washington, D.C. today, marijuana is legal. So during the 1830s in Washington, D.C., entrepreneurs of color were running restaurants, driving horse-drawn taxis, and working as government messengers. So a lot of free blacks. Slavery still existed too. And even in Washington, D.C., there were still slave auctions and slave pens. Around D.C., slave pens were where the slave traders gathered their human cargo to be shipped south from the docks of Georgetown. Abolitionist petitioners from the free states were demanding that Congress abolish the slave trade in the federal district. They conducted a political direct mail campaign where abolitionists sent their publications, bursting with illustrated stories of slavery's cruelties to the president, to congressmen, to professors, and to other leading citizens. What the abolitionists brought to Washington in the 1830s was not, hey, let's abolish slavery in this whole damn nation. No. What the abolitionists in Washington, D.C. were saying, let's abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. Even Andrew Jackson had slaves. So both abolitionists and the many white American slave owners and their politicians understood how important freedom for black folks, abolition, would be symbolically for the rest of the nation. President Andrew Jackson, who also owned slaves who worked in the White House while he was president, some of them slept in the attic. He had appointed old Francis Scott Key, old Frank Key, to be the state's attorney, the chief prosecutor for Washington, D.C. And Anna Maria Brudeau Thornton lived in D.C. with her slaves, too. Now, this is the story of Anna Marie Brudeau Thornton. In 1790, Anna Marie Brudeau Thornton, 16 years old, married William Thornton, 31. And 31-year-old William Thornton was the architect of the U.S. Capitol. Unlike her husband, however, Anna Maria Brudeau was not a Quaker, and because of that, William Thornton was expelled from the Quakers, from the Society of Friends, for marrying a non-Quaker, Anna Maria Brudeau. William Thornton came from a slaveholding family based on the island of Tortola, and after he died in 1828, although William Thornton's will granted freedom to his slaves, Anna Maria Brudeau Thornton and her mother, William Thornton's mother-in-law, liked having the comforts that free labor offered to them by the backs and the hands of the free black labor. One of Anna Maria Brudeau Thornton's slave boys, John Arthur Bowen, had once served in the president's house as a footman for Benjamin Ogle Taylor, Anna Maria Brudeau Thornton's friend. But on August 4th, 1835, President Andrew Jackson wasn't in D.C. He was vacationing that summer at a seaside retreat in southern Virginia, accompanied by his slaves. A story went around Washington, D.C. that John Arthur Bowen, a young 18-year-old enslaved mulatto man had attacked his female overseer in her own bedroom with an axe while she was sleeping. The Washington Globe newspaper declared that 60-year-old Anna Marie Thornton was a kind and indulgent mistress who had just been saved from butchery in her own chamber. Well, that wasn't true. John Arthur Bowen didn't attack anybody that August 4th, 1835 night or the morning of August 5th, but the mere implication that a black person was going to use violence in order to secure their freedom was enough to stoke the fears of some gangs of whites in D.C. to start a race riot. And that race riot will be called the Snow White Race Riot of 1835, also known as the August Snowstorm of August 1835. Violent, oppressive slave owners have always been worried about a slave uprising since the very moment they began their violent oppression against them. Since, you know, who in the fuck wants to be violently oppressed? Give me liberty or give me death, which lots of folks erroneously attribute to Patrick Henry, even though William Wirt actually put those words into Patrick Henry's mouth in 1817, decades after Patrick Henry had supposedly said it. So Patrick Henry never said, give me liberty or give me death. William Wirt would put those words into Patrick Henry's mouth in 1817. Even Thomas Jefferson was there for Patrick Henry's speech, and he was persuaded by Patrick Henry's speech, but he wasn't exactly sure what the fuck he said. Nobody did, and nobody wrote it down. So in 1817, many decades after Patrick Henry had supposedly said, give me liberty or give me death, William Wirt embellished. He lied, and he put some kick-ass words into Patrick Henry's mouth. Give me liberty or give me death. That's the reason why violent oppressors are worried that the ones that they oppress might fight them in order to get their freedom. And wouldn't that be just? Not only were slave owners worried, but poor white supremacists were afraid, too, of not being able to feel superior to somebody else. I remember one such anonymous Kentucky douchebag once typed online, I may be poor and dumb, but at least I'm white. How does being white make up for being poor and dumb? Oh, yeah. If you're a white supremacist, it makes you feel like you're above somebody else. And that's the reason why many of Kentucky's voters will vote for bigots into higher office, even if it fucks their own interests. Okay. So here's the precise story of John Arthur Bowen, a young 18-year-old enslaved mulatto man who had supposedly attacked his female massa oppressor in her own bedroom with an axe while she was sleeping. On the hot summer day of August 4th, 1835 at 11 p.m., some accounts say 1 a.m. in the morning, somewhere in the dead of night, John Arthur Bowen, the 18-year-old mulatto slave of Anna Maria Brodue Thornton, was walking around Washington, D.C. on Lafayette Square, called the President's Square back then, but it's called Lafayette Square today. And John Arthur Bowen was drunk out of his gourd past the 10 p.m. curfew, and he went into the house of his female massa commando oppressor, 60-year-old Anna Maria Brodue Thornton. She's the one that should have freed William Thornton's slaves, but she didn't. Inside the Thornton house, and so therefore she would have actually freed the slaves, John Arthur Bowen would have already been a free man. Inside the Thornton house on F Street between 13th and 14th Streets, John Arthur Bowen stumbled across an axe left on the basement stairwell. Arthur had picked it up so he could put it away in its proper place. John Arthur Bowen then walks into the bedroom where both Arthur's mother, Maria Bowen, and Anna Maria Brodue Thornton and Mrs. Brodue were sleeping, which would be Anna's mother. So you have three women who are sleeping in this room, and John Arthur Bowen walks in, and he's got the axe underneath the crux of his arm. So Arthur's mother, Maria Bowen, was a longtime slave and personal servant of Anna Maria Brodue Thornton. So you got the mistress, the William Thornton's ex-wife. He's dead now. She carries on, took his property and kept the slaves, kept them as slaves. Then she also keeps her John Arthur Bowen's mother as a slave too. And then her mother was sleeping in there as well. When Arthur was standing in the doorway with the axe in the crook of his arm, Anna wakes up, startled and frightened, and she runs by Arthur, out of the bedroom, out of the house, in order to go get some help from the neighbors. Arthur's mother, Maria Bowen, the longtime slave and personal servant of Anna Maria Brodue Thornton, she wakes up too. She goes up to John Arthur Bowen, takes the axe away from him, and then kicks John Arthur Bowen out of the house. Anna comes back with two neighbors, Henry Hunt, the president's physician, and Walter Gibson, an attorney who lived in Hunt's house. Maria told him that she was able to kick him out. So the problem's over, right? No. Outside the house, Arthur was pissed off about being locked out of the house and about being a slave. John Arthur Bowen picked up a scrub brush, and he started banging on the door with it. "I'll have my freedom," Arthur shouted. "I'll have my freedom, you hear me? I have as much right to freedom as you do. I've got just as much right to freedom as you." Where in the hell did John Arthur Bowen get that notion? Who told John Arthur Bowen about freedom and dignity and human rights? After getting nowhere with shouting about his human rights, John Arthur Bowen left. John Arthur Bowen stumbled back through the garden into the alley and then disappeared into the night. And that's it. That's the ordeal of him trying to murder her in her sleep with an axe. He didn't try to kill her. He didn't rush her. He didn't have the axe raised and try to kill her. He was just standing in the doorway, drunk, out of his mind. And he had the axe in between the crook of his arm. And that's it. Eventually, John Arthur Bowen goes back to Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton's home 1 or 2 days later, and then he's put in jail, then he's put on trial, and he's sentenced to be hung by his neck until he dies. So, was it a crime? Could it have been a crime? What was John Arthur Bowen's intent? And to be honest with you, none of this has much to do with the biography of Dr. Reuben Crandall, who's at the heart of this story. Dr. Reuben Crandall was 29 years old when the August snowstorm, the Snow White race ride of 1835, happened in Washington, D.C. And this is the first race riot in America. And the first race riot, this wasn't black versus white. This is a group of white people attacking black folks. That's what a race riot was for many years. Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton, who's about as much fun as a ton of thorns, was so startled that by that August 4th, August 5th, 1835 night, "Oh, I do declare he might have killed little old me, and I'm just a good old Christian girl with my dead husband's fortune and his slaves," who she's supposed to have freed. So if she would have done what William Thornton had wanted, none of this would have even have happened. John Arthur Bowen would have been a free man and got to dictate how he wanted to live his own life. So the next day, she was so startled by what had happened the previous night, she couldn't even bring herself to go to a musical party in Calorama that she had been planning on going to. So first she's woken up in the middle of the night during her beauty sleep, and now she's missing musical parties. Could anything else go wrong for poor Miss Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton? Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton put out an advertisement and offered a $100 reward for the capture of John Arthur Bowen. The constables, a.k.a. the police in those days, were usually the ones responsible for catching runaway slaves, and many of them were slave catchers on the side, or actually that would be their job here, and they would bring them back to their violent oppressors. Hence, that's the origins of the police. They have anti-black origins. They also have being the original strike breakers. That's another origin that they have. They're the original strike breakers. Just look at the protests going on in North Dakota. Which side are the police on? Are they defending the land and the people, or are they defending the corporations and the capital? Seton and Gale's newspaper, The Intelligencer, reported the incident as such. First fruit. A circumstance of a shocking character, which was within a second of time of resulting in the perpetration of a most bloody tragedy, occurred in this city 2 nights ago. On Tuesday night last, an attempt was made on the life of Mrs. Thornton of this city, the much-respected widow of the late Dr. Thornton, the superintendent of the patent office, by a young Negro man, her slave, which, from the expressions he used, was evidently induced by reading the inflammatory publications referenced to above. At 1:30 in the dead of night, Mrs. Thornton's chamber, in which slept herself, her aged mother, and a woman servant, was entered by the Negro, who had obtained access to it by forcing the outer door. He approached the bed of Mrs. Thornton with an uplifted knife. So, again, John Arthur Bowen didn't break into the house. He didn't rush towards Anna Maria Brodeur Thornton, nor did he have an upraised axe. But for the yellow sensationalist journalists, they didn't care. During the whole time that he was endeavoring to force a second entrance into the house, he was venting the most ferocious threats and uttering a tissue of jargon, much of which was a literal repetition of the language addressed to the Negroes by the incendiary publications. The Intelligencer's report was repeated verbatim in the Telegraph, and the Metropolitan embellished the story even more with a sensational yellow journalistic headline, "Desperate Attempt at Murder by a Negro in Washington." The Metropolitan disagreed on the motive for Arthur's attempted murder. They said, "We believe the Negro was incited to this foul deed by the hope of plundering a large quantity of valuable plate belonging to the lady, and not, as some would represent it, by the effect of any incendiary publication or language whatever." And in a way, the Metropolitan was actually defending John Arthur Bowen. It's kind of a defense. So instead of saying he was influenced by the abolitionist literature, no. He was an enlightened, educated Negro who wanted freedom for himself because he had read anti-slavery newspapers and pamphlets. No siree. Instead, John Arthur Bowen was nothing more than an opportunist and a thief. Some men started speculating where John Arthur Bowen, clearly an inferior, silly old Negro, would have got the ideas to think of himself as a free man. Dr. Henry King, a doctor who had an office on the First and High Streets, paid a call on his fellow physician earlier in the summer and noticed that Reuben Crandall kept an anti-slavery newspaper lying in his room. Henry King told this to William Robinson, who admitted that he had borrowed a copy of an abolitionist newspaper from Dr. Reuben Crandall. So that means William Robinson also had a copy of the abolitionist paper that is going to fuck over Dr. Reuben Crandall. Well, once George Oyster, a butter maker and the landlord of Dr. Reuben Crandall, found out about these stories of him owning abolitionist newspapers, he wondered if perhaps Dr. Reuben Crandall had said something to John Arthur Bowen and filled his head up with ideas of America being land of the free and home of the brave. Bullshit. That doesn't apply to the Negroes, clearly, for George Oyster. So George Oyster asked Dr. Reuben Crandall, "So did you hear the news?" And Reuben Crandall said, "No. A slave boy tried to murder Mrs. Thornton," George Oyster said. "He failed, but he got away. We got nobody to blame but the New Yorkers. They say the boy had been excited by these New York publications." Reuben Crandall, "I do not approve of them putting them into circulation. The excitement is too high anyways." Now George Oyster was more suspicious than ever. Who was talking about putting any of these publications in the circulation? Why would he say something like that? That seems awfully suspicious. And that stops for the first part of the story. But essentially what's going to happen, Francis Scott Key, a slave owner who authored the Star-Spangled Banner, he is going to put this abolitionist, Reuben Crandall, on trial. He's going to put him on trial, and he's going to push for the death penalty. And his crime was having abolitionist newspapers in his home, in the privacy of his own homes. He wasn't circulating them. He wasn't passing them around. He wasn't writing them. All he did, he had an abolitionist newspaper in his house, which that goes against not just freedom of speech, but it goes against the right to privacy. And, you know, it's also hypocritical because that other doctor said that he had borrowed William Robinson. He said he borrowed an abolitionist newspaper. So if he borrowed it, well, then that means he's distributing them. He's clearly distributing this literature.